Welcome to the Barbell Strategy Podcast,
where we talk about coaching,
training,
and all things strength and conditioning
to help the fitness athlete,
CrossFitter, and the coach. Please share and enjoy.
Sam, how was your spin class, mate?
It was interesting. Spin classes aren't what they used to be, that's for sure. I think the old David Lloyd spin class where you're just going from sitting to standing to up in the gears, I feel like those days are long gone. And this one was definitely a mix between spinning, a spin class, and a dance class. Just say. Which, as you know, for me, is a little bit out of my comfort zone. I'm not a dancer, let's be honest. But spinning away, push-ups on the handlebars, changing side to side, air punches, getting out the 1 kilo dumbbells, doing a few bicep curls.
Oh, mate, that sounds like a Zumba on a bike.
It was an interesting experience, but good fun. Good fun in some ways. Nice to try something different. I guess obviously it's just what happens when you don't have the same kind of training focus, and it's nice to mix things up a little bit, try new things. So I might not go back, I'll be honest. I might stick to assault bikes and bike ergs, but it was sometimes you just got to keep tabs on what's going on in the industry, just in case you want to transition.
You want to transition?
Yeah.
You're gonna be that hot coach at the spin studio who's got the hottest playlist and everyone wants to go to those classes. Is that
exactly?
Is that
full tri suit going on, nice and tight.
Oh,
get the tunes pumping, lights flashing. That's what it's all about these days now.
I remember I went to. I've done 2 spin classes in my time.
Yeah.
I went to one when I was working in Kuwait. It was actually pretty good. It was just like they were blasting some Tiesto, and it was like you going up the hills and all that business, and then you're standing and you got the high gear. That was actually pretty good. And then the other one I went to a Soul Cycle when I was in Chicago. They had like fucking candles, stuff like that.
Really?
Yeah, I was like, what's going on here?
Meditating.
No, it was just more of like I don't know, trying to get some, create a certain moody feel in the room or something like that. Anyway, but it was shit.
Entertaining, hey?
Yeah.
It's interesting just the way the industry's changing though. And you can see why people do it. It's like 45 minutes of in and out and you've done your exercise for the day. Obviously similar to why people like CrossFit classes. They just go, they turn up, they're told what to do, they feel like they've had a good workout, and they leave, eh?
Yeah. Well, we're gonna steer the conversation a little bit more towards, training for the sport of CrossFit, being a bit more competitive, and not just training to turn up for 45 minutes and get a sweat on. So in today's pod, we're going to be talking about long-term development, sort of continuing our first season. We decided that this is going to be season 1, talking about the coaching process. And I believe that a big part of that is going to be long-term development. And that is probably something that coaches think about a bit more than athletes do. I think if you ask an athlete, before they go into any new program or anything like that, they usually have a good idea in their mind of what training should look like over the next, say, 3 months, or what it should look like between now and the next competition or the next 2 competitions. But I think that idea of long-term development, how do we help athletes year after year, season after season, I definitely think that is something that coaches need to think about. They need to think about the qualification of an athlete or the skill level of an athlete and make sure that the training is appropriate for that, because there's definitely some different priorities and different needs that athletes will have at different stages in their training. So we'll get into a little bit of some of the details behind it. But first, Sam, what are some of the thoughts that you have that come to mind when it's about working with athletes long term? What are some of the things that you might consider a little bit more when starting to work with a beginner or more of an intermediate athlete than someone who already has, a good few years of training experience under their belt?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think obviously we're both lucky that we both kind of gone through that whole process. We started out as new to CrossFit, lots to learn. We've then progressed through that competition kind of phase, and now we're on the other side of it where we still use CrossFit to train, but we're not looking to compete in it, and we're looking for a way that fits, like we were saying before, like fits our lifestyle. So I think when it's, especially with beginner athletes and kind of the more intermediate athletes, that long-term plan is like you say, it's different to the more elite because of how many things they've got to start to work on, and the structure in which, or the way in which you do it to fit in around, obviously, like you say, they have, their vision does tend to be a little bit more short-term. So you've got to kind of factor that in, because I think if the visions differ too much, then you can struggle in terms of motivation. If you're both on separate pages, like there has to be that give and take a little bit in terms of what you might be working on at different times. And I think obviously as well, fitting in competitions, I feel like at different phases people might compete different amounts, because there's obviously that phase where you're trying to get as much competition experience as you possibly can, and you're not necessarily looking to peak for each competition, but you're developing that skill of competing, which is something that we'll talk about in the next podcast. And then it's a case of obviously every athlete is going to pick things up at different paces. So it's you might have an overall plan, but realistically, if that plan is a case of, okay, we're going to make sure we've got these things all sorted first, and then we move on to the next kind of level of skills or movements, you don't know how long it might take the athlete to get there, or what you might need to do to help them get there, depending on how, because obviously as you'd have seen, various people can pick up skills really quick, they've got really good body awareness, you can give them a couple of cues and they can make a change. And then you get others where they need much more repetition, things have to become much more kind of automatic for it to then fit together into the bigger picture of a whole skill. And then obviously within that, you've got so much individual variation, and it's then fitting that in with the athlete's goals and the level that they want to compete at, to make sure that they're working on the things that they need to work on that's going to benefit them the most at that particular time. Especially I think as athletes progress and as their kind of training age increases, then it might be that we have to focus on, I think we touched on it a little bit in one of the first podcasts when we spoke about masters athletes, and it's a case of, say, from a strength perspective, what can we continue to gain from a strength, and what might be better off focusing on kind of like movement efficiency and technique, or barbell cycling, strength endurance. So it's taking all those things and fitting them together into a plan that fits both the athlete, their goals, and then the time frame that you might be working with them, which again in obviously online coaching, it can vary quite significantly. I know I've had people I've been working with for almost 10 years, and then you get people who you might only work with for 6 to 12 months. So again, it's piecing all that together to have that long-term vision.
Yeah, for sure. I think it can be quite tough, because everyone has their sort of their view of how training should look and what they should be doing, and I think sometimes people, depending on the level of an athlete, they may have you could say misguided or just inaccurate ideas of where they're at. For example, it could be just people thinking that they say at more of an intermediate stage, and they want to be doing a program that sort of reflects that, whereas they are a beginner and they still are adapting at a rate as a beginner does. They still need to be working on getting their skill levels or their skills in balance and in check. I think that's a real big priority for beginners, is start off with a real broad training. If you can get someone good at CrossFit by sort of following just a GPP strength and conditioning program with some CrossFit thrown in there and some skill work and maybe a little bit of focus work here and there, but if you try to get as much of that as you can for a beginner, I think that's going to be really key. And then when someone is more intermediate and they've got a bit more experience playing the game, practicing their skills, they have a bit more, these weaknesses have started to, you could say, solidify a little bit. I think in that situation, that's when you need to be a lot more direct and a lot more focused. And the training probably at that intermediate stage is when things are super biased, and then eventually when they are a lot more experienced, generally speaking, it's going to be things like competition and managing training load over the long term, and your general training isn't going to be the general phases of training aren't going to be for as long, and the focus is going to be on working to the next competition, trying to maximize your results, learning what you can from those competitions, obviously taking an off season and having down periods and things like that, but it's going to be a lot more of a case of iterating the training process through competition rather than it following an idea of these are some good general ideas that we need to work towards. But I think that one of the things that people tend to do is they tend to skip steps quite quickly. And an easy example of this could be someone jumping onto a back squat cycle or a strength cycle too soon. And they may be a beginner and they may only need 1 to 2 heavy sets of squats per week to keep getting strong. And then all of a sudden, now that they're on a 3-day week program, and then they've just increased their, you could say they've increased their, the term would be like a maximum recoverable volume is really high now. So to now elicit any strength development within their squat actually takes a lot of work versus what it did before, which was only say 1 to 2 sets. And we see that quite often with also people just doing way too much CrossFit in the beginning and not necessarily just giving themselves time to develop their endurance or develop their capacity through simpler means. You don't need to be doing really highly technical workouts all the time. You can do pretty simple stuff and get pretty far. And then when you actually start to implement those training methods, which are maybe a little bit more direct and a bit more aggressive, they have a lot more of an effect, and you're just sort of elongating and you're stretching out that cycle of development. It's almost just extending the runway that someone's able to keep improving. And I think that far too often people cut that runway off too short by just doing training which is a little bit too aggressive and not necessarily the right thing to do at that time.
Yeah, no, 100%. But I think part of that as well is, especially when you're thinking about the long term and you talk about developing skills and the kind of the technical aspect of movements, I think people can get caught in a trap where they push really hard to hit certain strength numbers or to be able to do so many ring muscle ups, for example. But it can easily become a kind of, I want to get there anyhow. So they might be chasing a 100 kilo snatch and they might get it, but it might be, some kind of hybrid of some power snatch, muscle snatch, squat snatch kind of thing. And they hit their target and it's taken them, 12 months, say, to get there. But then they hit that wall where realistically they're not going to keep progressing at that rate unless they take a step back and start to focus a lot more on the technical aspect of the lift. And I think that, again, that's always like a challenging phase for people if they don't have the mindset if they don't have the long-term mindset, because it can be quite frustrating to then think, okay, I'm going to have to go back to snatching 70-80% consistently well, to then be able to take the steps forward that are going to allow me to consistently break past that 100 kilo barrier.
Yeah.
And I think that kind of intermediate phase of an athlete is kind of like the most frustrating phase, because I think as a beginner, you make a lot of progress quite quick, like you say, by doing a relatively general program, because there is so many new things and so much to improve. And then I think when you get to the experienced end and you can do all the skills, your technique's pretty solid, then again, it becomes more about enjoying the real doing part and the CrossFit stuff, which is what a lot of people want to do in the intermediate stage. Whereas the intermediate stage, when you're really refining things and there's so much to learn, and it can become quite frustrating, and equally it can become a little bit repetitive, because you don't have necessarily, because what you need to work on can be quite specific, you don't necessarily have the variation in your training that you can then have at a later date or at the start. But equally, then again, if you don't take the time to do that, you don't then kick on, and I think that's where people get stuck. But I think that's when people really need to think about what level they want to get to from a competition sense and what level they want to compete at, because then you can think, okay, well, if I'm trying to get to compete in, you know, RX or elite divisions, then I do just need to ride this out and kind of push through it.
Mm-hmm.
But actually, if I'm quite happy competing in scale divisions and that's what I enjoy, then obviously then you can think about what you want to focus on.
Yeah. Because I think a good part of coaching is also just knowing when not necessarily to push the progress, because I think it's pretty easy to make people progress in things, especially if these are new and novel ways of training for a lot of people. But it's important that you do that in a way which is like it's a little bit measured, and it might be about holding someone back. Well, not necessarily holding someone back. It's just making sure that someone gets to their end goal in as complete performance as possible. So you're not necessarily rushing to get there, because if you rush to get there, you're probably going to skip steps. You're going to have holes in your game and all those types of things. Or you might develop your absolute strength at the wrong time, or you may overcook it. And then we spoke about this in the last podcast, where pushing absolute strength, it can create this like false confidence in your ability, especially in CrossFit, when there's other things and there's other areas to actually develop. What would you say for when you just mentioned there with just figuring out what people's long-term goal is? And I mean, what are you looking at when that happens? Like, have you got any specific examples where, you know, you've been making some programming or training decisions based off of this person not wanting to compete at as high a level, or, you know, or when they actually do want to compete at a higher level, actually just sticking it out and being like, okay, no, we need to focus in on this, and it might not be about that next competition or that next PB.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think, especially when you're talking about people competing at a higher level, I think as a coach, it's your job to kind of keep the bigger picture in mind, because I think naturally athletes, they do take a short-term approach, and they do tend to think competition to competition. And if they're competing regularly, kind of, you know, at say 3-4 month intervals, and especially as it gets harder especially as the things that they need to improve perhaps slow down or they become more specific, it's very easy to go do one competition and kind of you have certain things that you need to work on, which are quite clear, but then to get to the next competition and you still have those same things to work on because you've got caught up in that, right, I've got 3 months, I need to make sure by the time this next competition comes around, I'm still just as fit or just as good at Olympic lifting, and they lose sight of that bigger picture, and it can become quite repetitive, where actually you look back over 12 months and okay, their strengths are still their strengths, but they've not really closed the gap between their weakness. They've not really brought their weaknesses up to the level that they could have done, which ultimately is what's going to give them the long-term progress to help them compete at a higher level overall. And I think, like, from a coaching perspective, then it's a case of putting that across to them in a way that keeps the buy-in there. You know, they can still compete, but it's also a case of when they do compete, if they're a little bit disappointed with certain aspects of their performance because it's been necessary to ease off something to focus on something else, it's a case of being able to keep that in perspective for them, to keep them focused on the long term and prevent that frustration kicking in. But I think I used to see it especially in the Middle East, because you would quite often find yourself competing against similar people. Whereas I think in kind of the UK and Europe, the competitions, they vary a lot more. So say in the Middle East, you do tend to find that people compare themselves to a specific person just as much as where they might have finished in a competition. So that comparison can be a little bit detrimental sometimes if they don't have the right mindset. And then I think on the flip side as well, like I say, I think some people, in terms of mental kind of energy or time, you know, they know that they need to work on something or things, and they put so much pressure on it that they then stop enjoying training. and then they end up training less, or they end up skipping out the things that they don't enjoy, which then again is then detrimental to them carrying on and progressing and competing at a higher level. And I've had people who say, they're like, look, I know these are my weaknesses, I know this is the stuff that I need to work on, but I don't enjoy it. It's taken away from the rest of my training. Actually, when you look at the whole picture of my life, I'm quite happy just focusing on, say, being as good at the movements that I've already got as I possibly can be, and just sticking at that level and just competing at that level. And obviously from a coaching perspective, that's absolutely fine. If they're clear and that's their goal and that's what they want, then obviously it's our job to make sure that, it might not fit with what we initially set out to do, but if the goal's changed, and you crack on.
Yeah, because I think keeping athletes engaged is going to be really important, because, the people, because we have people in our network, right? People that we competed against and stuff like that who've done really well, but what I would say is, like, with those individuals, if you just watch what they do, and they just got their head down and were consistent with it, and consistent with they competed a lot and that type of stuff, and that was the thing that sort of got them to those high standards, regionals, games, whatever. And I think keeping yourself engaged, and I think competition can be a big part of that. If I had a regret when I was competing, it was probably at one stage I didn't compete enough, and then when I sort of realised that I needed to do it more, it felt like it was a bit too late, and then and I sort of overdid it and ended up burning myself out. And I think that you gotta keep that enjoyment there, and keep yourself working towards something, especially when you're at that sort of more later intermediate stage where you know what it is you need to work on, and you are probably looking at things a little bit more longer term. You're looking at things over the course of a season. Okay, I'm going to use this competition to build up to this, and I think that that's going to be quite healthy to do, because a lot of people just drop off. They will continue trying to train, or trying to repeat the same process that they may have had when they were a beginner, as they go into those more intermediate and advanced stages. And then they fall short, and it becomes a point of frustration. They don't enjoy their training. But I think the being clear and being aligned on the goals is huge, and it's a big part of things is checking in and just sort of seeing, okay, where you're at. Are you still excited to compete and do all these things? And it could be a case of just factoring in a couple of competitions each year that you work towards, and just trying to use those as a bit of a measuring stick. I think the Open used to do a bit of a better job of that, whereas I think, more workouts, smaller field, all those types of things. But I think that it definitely, I'm not too sure when it was, but it reached a point where the Open wasn't necessarily a good measuring stick, because it was too varied, and the field was too big for you to sort of really get a good idea of where you're at. I do think that the people in that sort of those top percentiles, they're sort of still in and around there, but they use other competitions and they use other experiences to really measure where they're at. I think that that's something which you've got to try to build into your process, and it's really difficult now, because competitions are I was having this conversation with a client. The level and the standardization of competitions is different. You may have RX level over here is going to be different to RX level at that competition, and then you get people who are switching between individual of the same level. So let's say RX level, individual is always going to be a little bit more than what you see on the team side, but then you do get team athletes who may just flop between the divisions, and the demand for competing is so high. Especially here in Spain, there's a battle of something going on every week, and it's something which all the competitions have got, all these worms and everything like that. And I do think that sometimes having a bit more of this this perspective of just treating it a bit like, playing some Sunday league football with your mates, and you follow your program and you compete at these competitions which are local and that everyone's going to go to. You do your team competition, you enjoy it, and that's what you're in it for. But within that, there is always, you do generally get people who might just have a bit of a point of frustration where they may be putting a lot of time into their training and it's not necessarily materialising how they want it.
Yeah, definitely. I think the other thing is, especially when you're in that kind of intermediate stage when it is frustrating, I think it's giving yourself the opportunity to have time when you're perhaps not working on weaknesses. So let's just say over a 12-month period, it might be that you have, after each comp, say maybe after a competition, you take a month where you just do the things you enjoy. And it's still structured and it's still progressing you to where ultimately you want to get to, but it just takes a little bit of the mental stress out of it. And then from a long-term perspective, okay, you might get there a little bit later, but you still get there and you've enjoyed it a little bit more along the way. I think there's that can be quite a useful tactic with people sometimes. But I think the other thing that I do with people more now than what I used to do is, when people come, because, it's very easy to say when you sign up to a coaching program, this is where I want to get to. And I think one thing that I do a lot more now is speak to people and say, okay, this is where you want to get to. You said, let's just say, for example, you want to get to semi-finals. This is what, this is the commitment that it's going to require to get there from where you are now. Because realistically, for some people, it's going to be it could be a 3 to 4 year process of consistent training. And, you're not talking an hour a day, you're talking hours a day. So for someone to be able to go through that is a challenge in itself, regardless of, just the normal challenge that comes with pushing yourself and getting to that level. Like you say, sometimes it is just the turning up that can be the hard part. And I guess we're lucky that we've been through that, so we kind of know how hard it was for us to get there. But I think, for a lot of people, realistically these days, most gyms don't have a semi-final athlete in there that sets an example so people can actually see the work that goes into it. So it's very easy to say, oh, well, if I just keep training an hour and a half a day, then I'll get there. But obviously the reality is most semi-final athletes are training twice a day for, 3, 4, sometimes 5 hours. And that is the commitment that it really takes to get there if you're going to get to that position. And I think that can help either it helps people actually rethink goals, or it helps ease a little bit of the frustration because they actually understand, okay, that might be my goal. Either it's going to take me a little bit longer to get there, or I perhaps just need to turn things down a little bit based on the actual time I have and how it's actually going to fit with my lifestyle.
Yeah, because it's very difficult. I do remember working with an athlete before, and she was trying to get to semi-finals, in one of these easier regions, and she was able to manage her training and do pretty well and get pretty close, while she had a lot of other things going on. And then it was like the year that she wanted to really push for it, and there was just resistance there, and it would be, okay, 4 to 5 training sessions per week. It's not really going to get you there. And then the standard of competition every single year increases and increases and increases. And I do think I think we're finding that sort of tipping point where I don't think some people can train more than they actually are. But as a sport and as the level increases, you are finding that just a general CrossFit competitor who is competing at a good level, let's say semi-finals, something like that, they train just as much as a professional athlete, and they have to treat their lives as such. And that can be really, really, really difficult, especially when you don't necessarily work at a CrossFit gym, which, the majority of people who are competing at that level are coaches, and they will be coaching, let's call it 4 hours a day, maybe 3 classes in a personal training session. They will probably try to squeeze out as much of their day as possible devoted towards just training and chilling out. There's not really the mental energy to read a book or do an online course or try and do anything else, let alone try and have a social life and those types of things. I think the people always very, very much miscalculate the time demands of competing at a certain level, and I think that they just don't necessarily have like a good idea of like how it works as well. I spoke to someone who's training and we're focusing on their weightlifting, and they're interested in like competing more often and all of these types of things. But they have such a compartmentalized view on training. They think that they have several skills that they need to work on, so there needs to be like a different program for that skill and a different program for that skill, and so it's like it doesn't work quite like that. you can do all these things in one session. It does definitely take a bit of time for people just to sort of get used to.
I think, even if it did work like that, it's having the time to do it. Because if you're an Olympic weightlifter and your Olympic weightlifting session can be very, very specific to very specific weaknesses you might have, and you might go through your session and you might do some full lifts, and then you might do some pulls, and then you might do some, squats, and you might do some kind of targeted accessory exercises, and it can all be very specific because you're working on something very specific. Whereas if you're then talking about trying to apply that to CrossFit, if you're going to say, right, well, I'm going to do all these things for my snatches, I'm going to do all these things for my cleans, then all my ring muscle ups, there's this specific part of a ring muscle up that I really struggle with, so I'm going to spend 40 minutes doing drills or strengthening exercises to work on that, and then it can escalate so fast, and all of a sudden you've gone from training for 2 hours a day to 6 hours a day, and it's impossible. Or you do all those things, but each one thing takes your whole session, and you do things so infrequently that you don't do it often enough to actually benefit from it.
Especially with skill work, because you need those continuous. You need to be touching those skills on a regular basis.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I think part of it does come down to the sort of program. Yeah, part of it does come down to the programs which are available online. Because if you have someone who wants to focus in on a certain skill or a movement or whatever, you can go onto these websites. I think one of the examples would be WordPrep, or you can go to one of these these programming companies, and they may have 6 to 8 week cycles specifically focusing on X skill or X movement, and then it's just people think that they need to stack all these programs on top of each other, and I think a big part of a coach's job is, both you and I don't write programming like that, but we know how those programs work, and we need to be able to prioritize and reduce these things down to like the real key and core components. And this is where you might look at a skill like a muscle up, and you, like you said before, you're looking at a very particular part of the muscle up which needs work. Okay, we don't necessarily need to be doing, if it's trying to coordinate the transition for a kipping muscle up, do we need to be doing false grip, chest to ring holds, and doing all these types of things? Can those things help? Yeah, in a general sense, but we don't necessarily need to be doing that. Like, we need to be working on transition drills, and I think a big part of a coach's job, and this is something which, with, I would say, the less experienced athletes I work with, a big part of it is being able to distill all of these different things that need work and put it into 5 90-minute training sessions per week, and just being able to move things along, prioritize. But you could be in a situation, right, where, bringing it back to this long-term development, you could be in a situation where, the transition is the thing that needs work. And rather than being very direct and focused on the transition, you might actually do your false grip, chest to ring holds, because you might need to be building up that general ability. And in, let's say, 4, 6, 8 weeks, then you're starting to do those transition drills, and all of a sudden you have a reserve of strength which allows you just to be able to practice for longer and really push it. I think this is something which is very key for CrossFit coaches and online programs to do, because it can just be a case of, stitching together a squat cycle with a little weightlifting cycle. And I think I remember, what was it? It may have been Facebook. Do you remember the owner of what was that? Into CrossFit.
Oh, yeah.
He used to. It was Jack. Yeah. He used to run the Battle of London, I think it was.
Yeah.
And I think one time it was on a Facebook group or something, UK CrossFit or something, and obviously everyone was throwing their ideas around training. That was a group, eh?
Oh, that was entertaining.
And I think he made a joke about Outlaw just basically being a Catalyst athletic cycle with a Metcon thrown at the end. But I remember that was how people used to program, and I think that's also a fine way of actually programming now, to be honest with you. But you when I have athletes and they show me their previous training, it looks like that. It looks like a Catalyst athletic cycle, some Metcon, tons of EMOMs thrown in there as well. And I'm like, you were doing way too much. You could do a lot less of this, and you would still be making improvement.
That's it. I think though as well, like when you compare, like say those 8-week programs, obviously they're designed to be very specific, and you're also, I don't think the people who are selling them are expecting people to buy all 5 and do them all at the same time.
Yeah, there's probably that written down in an FAQ somewhere.
Yeah, but I think inevitably that's what happens, and then the people either end up doing way too much, like you say, or there's a lot of overlap between them, but they do it anyway, or it just becomes so diluted that again there's no benefit there. Whereas I think when you work how we work, you have that benefit of looking at a week as a whole and everything that's going into that week, and it might be that on a one day you do some muscle up transition work that's very specific and very focused.
Hey everyone, Matt Harvey here. I produced this podcast that you're listening to or watching just now, so if you like the way that it looks and sounds, that's partially down to me. If you've got a podcast, video, or other online project that you'd like some production help with, or even if you just want to chat through some ideas, drop me a DM or an email. My details can be found in the show notes below. Thanks so much for your time. On with the show.
But then, a couple of days later, you might do muscle ups, but you might do it as part of a Metcon. But so you see it and you see all the different movements and the different volumes of movements that they're doing over that week as a whole. Whereas I think quite often people can think, yeah, I did it in the Metcon, but that doesn't count because that's my Metcon. And like you say, that it becomes very segmented and very stitched together. And then people do end up just keeping adding. And that's where, again, long term, that leads to that burnout, or at least to, like what we joked about when I was 18, 19, you end up with your sessions taking you 4 hours of loads of stuff, which is just, overdoing it on things that ultimately are doing the same thing,
Yeah, for sure. We don't have a problem of programming in the CrossFit world. I think we don't have that. That's not the hard thing to find. You can find a training cycle that's going to help you do whatever you want if you need to improve whatever movement it is. We don't have a programming problem at all. I think the thing we actually need to do, and this is the reason why people hire coaches, is it's about prioritization. It's about understanding, what an actual training session is going to feel like when you're doing all of these different things. And sometimes I think that I know that good athletes don't necessarily make good coaches, but I do think that having a bit of an idea of how things work as an athlete, of just going through years and years of training, you start to just pick up on these sort of little discrete things which will work and what don't necessarily work. And I know of coaches out there who haven't necessarily competed, or maybe they have come from more of a sports science background, and some of the training sessions that you see put together, you're just like, this is either like really low volume and you can't grasp like how much capacity CrossFit athletes actually have, especially advanced CrossFit athletes. Like there's a lot of traditional S&C stuff that you can just throw out the water, or the other end of it, it's just really compartmentalized, and there is a way too much training volume, and there isn't necessarily, if you're doing so many things, it's like which bits are important. You can't really prioritize. And the other end of that is people who have a more of a background coaching in affiliates, and then they try to start writing some competitive programs, and you sort of see it, and it's like, well, this just looks like a class program with like some extras and things like that. So I do definitely think that I'm glad I've worked with quite a few coaches and followed quite a few blogs, and I did have a couple of spells of just doing my own programming, because I learned so much from it, and I know what sort of works, and there's some stuff I tried that was just absolute shit, and there's other things which have worked really well, and a part of my, a big part of my programming is copying those things and refining it and finding sort of my own way with it. But I think, having some experience yourself of just seeing how should a training session like look and feel is a big one. And those types of skills aren't necessarily developed by reading textbooks and just observing. You actually need to go into the session and actually do it as well.
Yeah. No, you're right. But I think ultimately that's what coaching is, isn't it? It's you look at everything that's out there, you take the bits that you think are the best, you try it, you see what works. If it works, you either stick with it or you look for ways to refine it. If it doesn't work, then you look at something else. And I think the more experience you get as a coach, I think you get to understand that. But I think you also really understand the individual variation that comes with that too, because what works for me wouldn't necessarily work for you. So it's a case of having, all these different ideas, all these different potential strategies that in theory work, and then it's finding, okay, with this person, this works really well, with this person it doesn't, so let's try this one and let's see how that goes. And equally, so then it's a case of being willing to admit when something hasn't worked and that it's okay to change it. And obviously then talking to the athlete about that as well and saying, well, we tried this, it hasn't worked. It could be because of this, let's try this. And the longer you work with someone, because this is part of the long-term thing as well, the longer you work with someone, the more you get to know them and what works for them, the more efficient that process becomes. And it gets to the point where you do have a very good idea of what an athlete needs at certain times of year or to achieve certain things in terms of how much volume they might need or how much they can tolerate, all that kind of stuff. You really do get to know. But then I think the other thing, part of it with like what you're saying about having competed in CrossFit is you understand what CrossFit actually is at a competitive level, and all the compartmentalization and things like that. Ultimately that's not what CrossFit is as a sport. So even if you might do that at certain times of year with a person, there has to be those periods of year where everything is much more of a blended approach. But then this is where the skill comes in as a coach and the experience, because it's a case of, okay, we're going to keep that variety so that we're making it in some way specific to CrossFit, but then it's a case of varied but not random. And again, I think that's a trap people fall into, where they do just throw everything together, and it can become very random. There's no structure to it, and then you can almost do too much or do too much of the wrong things, and then actually, okay, you're training hard, but you're not necessarily making any progress.
Yeah, because there are times when it makes sense to work on things in that sort of more individual level. But yeah, for sure, CrossFit isn't necessarily the individualization of training in CrossFit is hugely amplified because you have so many different things that you're sort of working on. And I sort of bring this back to the idea of, as a coach, your job isn't necessarily just to get them fitter, stronger, and more powerful and more enduring and all these things. You're obviously trying to develop physical qualities, but at the same time, you have this tactical and technical element of it as well, where you're more like a sports coach. So you have to adapt the training to maximize those areas as well. It's not just with weightlifting, it's pretty clear cut of what works pretty well. Yeah, there's going to be a variation individual to individual, but it's a pretty simple sport. Same with running, same with, if we look at, for example, someone who is doing hybrid, they're combining long distance running with powerlifting. Okay, you've got two competing things there, but it's pretty simple in terms of how we work on those individual elements and how we can, take away some of the stuff so it doesn't negatively affect the other stuff too badly. But with CrossFit, there's just so much that you need to be working on. Any little individual difference is just going to be, the program will look very different. And I think I've always gone through this trying to sort of systemize my thinking, and I often do this thought process of, okay, well, what's going to be like the most sort of balanced program? And I tell you what, they always tend to look pretty similar, and I used to do this a lot more often. And I would say that my programming looked a little bit more repetitive, individual to individual previously. But now it's, all the programs I write just look completely different, and it's just because I've been able to understand and I've gained the experience of how to work on things and how to maximize certain things, and a lot of the trial and error that you have, that's something which you need to practice and just go through the years of coaching to sort of come out and understand, okay, well, I've sort of seen this problem before, I'm going to try and use this progression here. And yeah, you with time you become a little bit more accurate, but with working with athletes, it does take a while to sort of build that understanding of them, because you will come across situations where it's like, why is this not working? They do happen still. It's not going to be an exact science ever.
No, and I think equally, as an athlete, the longer you work with an athlete as well, things can change in their lives, that then something that worked 2 years ago might not necessarily work now. Whether that's their work-life balance has changed, whether that's they're just, as you get older, your physiology is changing. So it is a case of, you might always have an idea, but as you say, the level of individual variation is potentially endless. So it's a case of being able to tap into that and apply it in a logical and structured way when they need it to really maximise their progress over the long term.
Yeah, because you're constantly trying to make good, informed, pragmatic decisions in someone's training, and I think that the individualization can be something which, is, if you were to just look at, let's say, 5 different people, 5 different programs, and they're all completely different, they're all individualized, it will just be chaotic to look at. But I know that you'll be able to draw common themes within them, and then as much as there is a high level of individualization that's needed in CrossFit, there are still principles, there are still methods which are generally good to do, and it's, you're going to squat a couple of times a week, you're going to Olympic lift, you're going to do all these things, right? But yeah, so I suppose just wrapping up and just bringing it back to this idea of long-term development, I've got a couple of notes here. So I think with a beginner, we're trying to get as much as we can from being as broad and general as possible, and also low in training dose. We don't want to give them too much. I think a big part of things is just ensuring that there's balance in the program. You're trying to bring up everything so that they can then just move through those next stages of their development where they don't necessarily have big holes in their game. And there's an element of learning and just enjoying the sport, and obviously just not skipping steps, which I think is something which we spoke about on today's pod. It just happens way too often. People are just doing way too hard training for fixing one little thing, and it doesn't necessarily need that. It might just need a bit more time. When we're looking at intermediate athletes, things are going to start to specialize a little bit. You're going to start to really get stuck in and working on those weaknesses. And I think that that's the time to like really go deep and really focus on developing those areas. And what will end up happening is you'll notice you might have more sport specific weaknesses, skills, things like that, or you might have more of like an athlete specific weakness. So it could just be someone who just needs to always be, topping up their endurance or topping up their absolute strength and always be working on those things. And sometimes those things just sort of solidify, and you might have an advanced athlete they have something that is just always there that they need to work on. But the sport for those individuals is going to really inform how they train and how things move training cycle to training cycle. And it's going to be iterating that process, going from competition to competition, focusing on managing loads so that they are good for those competitions. They're not picking up like little injuries and that type of thing, and just refining their game. And I think that looking at it from that start out broad, go deep, and then go back to broad again, I think that can be quite a useful way of looking at long-term development. Which, sometimes it begs the question is like, what is defined as a beginner or intermediate or advanced? But that's another pod. But for the next podcast, we'll be focusing on the competition process and talking about how we would prepare athletes for that. What does it look like going through just the actual competition? What are the things we're trying to help athletes with? But then what do things look like competition to competition? And I suppose that sort of comes a bit full circle with our conversation today about long-term development. But anyway, thank you very much for listening, and do the podcast thing, give us 5 stars, and share this with your other coaching friends, or if you're an athlete and you're getting something from this as well, share it with your athlete friends. Make sure you give us 5 stars.